Good afternoon. It's very good of you all to join us today. As always, it's good to be here with you. My colleagues Ashley Mitchell and Sam Rose and I are pleased to be presenting the 7th webinar in ConMaciel's monthly webinar series today. And as we, as we look at the schedule of our webinars, we realize that we have timed this webinar well. We have titled it OSHA and Climate Change. And we are talking about some of the major impacts climate change will have on employers' responsibilities to keep their workers safe and healthy, and the role OSHA will play in that effort. As national parks burn, the Southwest continues to experience a record heat wave and drought. We've had in the last year both a record number of mudslides and very, very tragically, a record number of workers killed by tornadoes. And as we head into what summer indicating may be the most active hurricane season we have seen in the modern era. So our timing is good, unfortunately. I'd like to begin our webinar with just a few introductory remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to my very bright and astute colleagues, Sam and Ashley, who will bring us up to speed on two of the most significant developments in our OSHA world resulting from climate change impacts. And then I will close out our session today with some final words. And probably in between, as Sam and Ashley are talking, may interrupt a few times and pipe in with some thoughts that I hope will be useful to our audience. At first glance, climate change seems more quintessentially in the purview of EPA rather than OSHA. It is primarily and fundamentally about impacts and consequences on the environment. However, as we move from the theoretical and predicted, scientists' predictions of what could and likely would happen to real, actual experienced climate change, we see the significant role that OSHA may have in addressing the impacts of climate change. And we see the increased role and responsibility employers like you all will have in dealing with its impacts. We certainly don't have time in this. I think this is scheduled for 1 hour, and I know we do not have time in this hour to address or even touch on really all of the aspects of this, what seems to me to be a multidimensional and very complex topic of climate change and its impacts on U.S. employers. So we have chosen to highlight what are likely, at least in the near term, the most significant developments in our little OSHA world of climate change. Federal and state plan states focus on heat stress and heat illness and what's happening in that area. Western state plan states focus on wildfire and wildfire smoke. And employers' obligations generally on emergency preparedness and how the changing role caused by climate change has increased superstorm activities and natural disasters, and that has thereby increased the role and responsibility we have as employers to keep our employees safe in those events and in the aftermath of those events. As I was thinking about how to begin this webinar, I thought initially as I was walking my dog this morning before 8 a.m. in what felt like over 90-degree weather, and it actually wasn't today. It was only in the high 70s, low 80s, but I'm sure it will be tomorrow or the next day here in DC. So we are in the midst of the dog days of summer here. And we've had some good luck so far, but I'm certain before this summer is over, we're going to have some record-breaking heat waves. I was thinking about how best to sort of convey the message that we wanted to convey to you all about OSHA in the context of climate change. And I thought about, pictures and doing some sort of photo documentation of the role climate change has played related to U.S. workers or where OSHA has been involved in climate change issues, disaster preparedness, disaster recovery, those kind of things. And I was sort of thinking about what that slide presentation would look like. And the layover song came to mind, how all slideshows have a cool layover song. And what came to mind was that song, winter, spring, summer, or fall, all you have to do is call and OSHA will be there. All right, I will stop. Now, I can only do that because I can't see any of you. And as far as I know, there's really no one on the other line, on the other end of this laptop. So I'm sitting here alone on my deck. And also because I happen to know that my colleague and partner and friend, Eric Kahn, happens to be boarding a plane at this exact time. And so he cannot possibly have Wi-Fi and cannot possibly be signed into this webinar. So I decided I'd do a little song. Seriously, my point is that OSHA will have a bigger role to play if they're involved. We see, we saw last year what happened at the Supreme Court with the vax or test rule, and we know that the court's view of at least the coronavirus was that it was not a workplace hazard, not a quintessential workplace hazard, and therefore OSHA did not have authority to regulate it. Query whether at least some of the hazards associated with climate change fall into that same category. I think only time will tell how that resolves itself ultimately. But we do know this. We know under a Democratic administration, there currently is, in fact, an effort to vigorously regulate climate change hazards. In a Republican administration, there will likely be they will sort of recede from an aggressive regulatory approach to perhaps a more, what is thought of as a more employer-friendly compliance assistance approach. But regardless which administration is in control of the agency, the more we continue down this journey or into this new, Anthropocene era, we as employers, either with OSHA sort of, in a Democratic administration holding a gun to our heads or nudging us along from the back in a Republican administration, we as employers need to be paying more attention to protecting our workers when natural disasters occur, because they will be more frequent, more severe, and more widespread. So with that sort of introduction, let me turn it over to Ashley Mitchell. We're going to talk about heat and heat illness and all things coming out of federal and state OSHA's related to heat. Ashley, take it away.
Thanks, Kate, and hello, everyone. As Kate mentioned, we will now be turning to heat illness and prevention. And so with that being said, let's just give ourselves a basic groundwork here, a framework for understanding what we mean when we say heat illness. This comes from the Cal OSHA definition. Heat illness means a serious medical condition resulting from the body's inability to cope with a particular heat load, and symptoms include heat cramp, heat exhaustion, heat syncope, and heat stroke. And so serious heat-related illnesses occur or can occur when the body temperature exceeds 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And fatal heat-related causes are usually the result of heat stroke, where the physical activity and hot environment causes the body temperature to reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, where we know that normal body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so with that definition in mind, or with those general understandings in mind, we turn next to heat hazards. And so heat is the leading weather-related killer, and it is becoming more dangerous, as 18 of the last 19 years were the hottest on record. Excessive heat, as mentioned, can cause heat stroke and even death if not treated properly. And so one key occupational risk factor for heat illness is the lack of acclimatization. And acclimatization is important on quote unquote hot days, but it's also important for new employees and employees who may have taken time off and are returning to the hot work environment. And so other occupational risk factors for heat hazards are heavy physical activity and just general hot environmental conditions. And then on top of those occupational risk factors, there are also personal risk factors, which include the employee's pre-existing medical condition, lack of fitness, previous episodes of heat-related illness, their alcohol and caffeine intake, as well as drugs and other medical conditions. And so per OSHA's own safety and health topic page, for employers who have employees that may be predisposed to heat illness, the first place employers should start is estimating the workload of their employees, looking at what environmental factors are present, whether employees are spending a significant amount of time outdoors, whether or not it's warm when they're outside, if they're in and out, if they're receiving adequate amounts of shade. The next step would be to measure the environmental heat using what's referred to as the wet bulb globe temperature, or the WBGT, or a similar method, because heat index alone is not necessarily sufficient. As I know we heard Kate mention, she said it felt like 90 degrees, but it was in the high 70s, low 80s. And so that wet bulb globe temperature is also going to take into account some of the other factors that really affect how the employee's body is feeling in the heat outside. The third thing employers should look at is if the worker is wearing clothes or protective equipment that can impair heat dissipation, and then add clothing adjustment factors to the measured WBGT, and this process will yield what's known as the effective WBGT. And then fourth, employers should determine whether the worker is acclimatized to heat or not. And when I say acclimatized, I just mean that that particular employee has had a chance to adjust to the temperatures and the heat environment. And so in general, employers should assume that workers are unacclimatized or unaccustomed to working in that high heat environment if they have been doing the job for less than 1 to 2 weeks. And then not to forget that for employees who take time off, take summer vacation, that those employees who are returning after being off for a significant period of time would also be unacclimatized. And then finally, using the table that we see here to determine whether the total heat stress in and of itself would be hazardous to the employees in your workplace. And so turning now to how OSHA has historically approached heat illness. So under the OSHA Act, employers are responsible for providing workplaces free of known safety hazards. This includes protecting workers from extreme heat. And so because every year, unfortunately, dozens of workers die and thousands more become ill while working in extreme heat or humid conditions, OSHA has taken a number of steps to address heat hazards, including a heat illness prevention campaign, as well as issuing letters of interpretation. For the time being, Fed OSHA currently relies on the general duty clause to protect workers, but that is likely to be even more difficult as we look forward in light of the OSHRIC opinion in Sturgill. And I'll just go over that really briefly. In Sturgill, the employer was a roofing employer based in Ohio, and one of the employees collapsed while working on a roofing project and subsequently died. OSHA conducted an inspection and issued the roofing company 2 serious citations under the general duty clause for exposing the employee to the hazard of excessive heat from working on a commercial roof and the direct sun. And the second, in violation of the construction standard for failure to train employees in the recognition and avoidance of unsafe conditions. And so OSHRIC found that the secretary failed to prove the existence of a hazard where the record failed to establish that the National Weather Service's heat advisory chart applied to the conditions employees of the company were exposed to, because there was no evidence in the record that the workers had prolonged exposure to high heat index values. In fact, the commission found that the National Weather Service had not even defined prolonged exposure or that the work involved strenuous activity. And so with that being said, that opinion in Sturgill from OSHA significantly limited OSHA's ability to use the general duty clause citation. But as we will continue to discuss, that has not stopped OSHA from issuing an NEP, conducting heat-related inspections, and they have also undertaken a rulemaking process, which I know Kate will get into greater detail about later. And so with that being said, we will look at how OSHA is approaching heat under the current administration, the Biden administration, which has announced enhanced measures to protect workers in hot environments. So originally, OSHA was relying on their adage, heat, rest, and shade. The Biden administration has stepped that up to include enforcement initiatives on heat-related hazards, a heat illness national emphasis program, and launching a workplace heat illness rulemaking, all of which we are getting ready to discuss in greater detail, starting with the enforcement initiative. And so the enforcement initiative states that when the heat index exceeds 80 degrees Fahrenheit, serious occupational heat-related illnesses become more frequent, especially when unacclimatized workers, those workers who are not used to working in that high heat index, are performing heavy, strenuous work. For example, intense arm and back lifting work, carrying, shoveling, manual sawing, pushing and pulling heavy loads, and working at a fast pace, especially when these workers do not have easy access to water or shade or are working in direct sunlight. So back to OSHA's water, rest, and shade. Heat-related fatalities have occurred when the heat index is below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, particularly when those aggravating factors are present. And so because of that, the heat initiative has identified heat priority days as those days when the heat index exceeds 80 degrees. And a reminder that a heat index at this level indicates a need for OSHA to increase its enforcement efforts to identify potential heat-related hazards that may be present in the workplace, and identify those conditions before the occurrence of an illness or a death. And as Kate mentioned, we will talk about state plans as well this afternoon. And state plans are strongly encouraged to adopt OSHA's NEP. And so just a couple more words about the enforcement initiative. Under the enforcement initiative, heat-related health inspections will be scheduled with the highest priority given to fatality inspections and then to other unprogrammed inspections such as complaints and referrals. And then there will also be certain follow-up inspections from work sites that were previously inspected for heat-related hazards. And then turning next to OSHA's National Emphasis Program. Under the Biden administration, OSHA has also announced a heat-related hazards National Emphasis Program, or NEP for short. And its purpose is to ensure that employees in high hazard industries are protected from heat-related hazards, both those indoors and outdoors. And I want to place a particular focus on those indoors, because I know typically when we think of heat hazard, we think about employees who are working outside, but the NEP focuses both on inside and outside work that may lead to serious illnesses, injuries, or death. And so this NEP augments OSHA's ongoing efforts related to heat hazards. It's a pretty broad list of high hazard industries, but covered industries generally include general industry, construction, maritime, and agriculture. And so for employers who are in these high hazard industries or where workers are otherwise exposed to heat related hazards, there are steps that you can take to protect your employees, including conducting a hazard assessment focused on heat and heat related hazards. And to the extent that the hazard assessment demonstrates that there is a risk for heat related illness, employers should develop a heat illness and injury program with measures meant to reduce the adverse effects related to heat illness. For example, employers may choose to add cold water stations throughout their facilities, similar to the way hand sanitizer stations were added and continue to be refilled throughout the pandemic. Or employers who have employees that work outdoors may choose to alter work schedules such that employees are not working during the hottest part of the day. And so under the NEP, OSHA will conduct programmed inspections in those 70+ high-risk industries. There will be 3 different types of inspections under the HEAT NEP. The first type being unprogrammed inspections related to fatalities, hospitalizations, complaints, and referrals. The second being monitoring inspections for employers who have received a hazard alert letter. And then the third being programmed inspections for those employers that are listed on the high-risk industry list. And then it's important to note that because the hazard is, and because heat hazards fall under this NEP, even if your workplace is not subject to one of those unprogrammed monitoring or programmed inspection, if OSHA is on site for a different reason, they can expand the scope of their inspection to heat-related hazards. And so NEP inspections related to heat hazards will look specifically at measures in place to protect workers on heat priority days. Just a friendly reminder, those heat priority days occur when the heat index for the day is expected to be 80 degrees Fahrenheit or more. And so during those inspections, OSHA will assess the potential for heat-related serious illnesses and injuries where such hazards may exist in both indoor and outdoor work areas, including a review of the employer's records for heat-related emergency room visits, interviewing workers about heat illness and related symptoms, and determining if the employer has a heat illness program. So again, if you're conducting that hazard assessment and realize that heat illness is something that could be a potential hazard in your workplace, taking those next steps is especially important in the event that even if you're not a part of a targeted NEP inspection and OSHA's on site and they expand their workplace inspection to look at heat illness, you are prepared and have taken those steps to keep your employees safe. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate to discuss the third step that OSHA has taken as it relates to heat illness.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I really appreciate it. Okay, so what I want to share now, I'd like to spend the first few minutes or the next few minutes talking about the federal standard rulemaking that is going on right now for heat illness. All right, heat illness rulemaking, what's happening? OSHA has been focused on a heat illness rulemaking for some time. Nothing happened during the Trump administration much in terms of the rulemaking, but things really geared up with the Biden administration. In October of last year, October 27th, the agency published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. That's an ANPRM. We've got a slide in here that's going to kind of talk about the rulemaking process to give you context for what this means. It's not the first stage of a rulemaking. In fact, the agency for years before issuing an ANPRM has been doing work in the area that is the subject of the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. That was the case here. Even during the Trump administration, lots of background work was going forward, studying, looking at literature, caucusing, meeting with interagency groups. A whole lot of stuff was happening in the background. From a public standpoint, though, this is one of the first opportunities that stakeholders have to discuss with OSHA what stakeholders believe the rules should look like. And ANPRM, and certainly this heat ANPRM, looks essentially like a request for information. It's, I think OSHA had, I want to say 114 questions or topics that it asked the public to comment on in the ANPRM that was issued in October of last year. My colleagues and I represent a broad coalition of employers that have an interest in this heat illness rulemaking, and we put together a coalition called, I believe, the Heat Illness Prevention coalition, and we provided comment to OSHA on many, many of those topics and some other things that we thought were important in the context of the ANPRM. The ANPRM is also really, in some ways, the first opportunity that most of the public gets to understand what OSHA's thinking about in terms of what a rule might ultimately look like. Here, what we learned from looking at the ANPRM is there are a number of pretty critical pieces to what likely will be ultimately a final heat illness rule. The first thing is, OSHA doesn't do anything without a written program. Wise or not, that is OSHA's position almost always, that there should be a written program. Certainly with heat, OSHA is going to require in any final rule a written heat illness prevention program. And we have been working with clients over the last year or so, actually some longer than that, to develop written programs. Just because we don't have a requirement doesn't mean you shouldn't have one. Actually, I think written programs, if they're done well, can be nice guideposts for your safety folks to understand what to do and what not to do, and what is necessary and what is not necessary. Just sort of an instruction manual, if you will. So there is likely going to be a written requirement for a heat illness program. Second, engineering controls. We all know OSHA's hierarchy of controls, right? Engineering controls, the most important, administrative controls next, PPE is the final line of defense against a hazard. Here, OSHA, of course, is focused on engineering controls. What would engineering controls be in the context of a heat illness rule? Well, what they might be, is air conditioning, right? Some sort of mechanical way that you can provide cool air to your employees, either air conditioned rooms or shade tents if it's outdoor environment, some sort of cooling room. Now, one thing I should make sure everyone understands, on the federal level, OSHA is considering this rulemaking to be an indoor and an outdoor rulemaking. So they're looking at doing a rule that will cover both. We don't know whether that's going to end up where the agency goes, but we do know that at least in the ANPRM, that's what OSHA is talking about. So engineering controls inside and even outside, possibly cooled forced air shade tents, possibly. Now, enough on that. I'll tell you what we kind of commented on as a coalition, if we have time, or we can talk about it offline. Administrative controls, the next line of defense. This is really critical for heat. Work rest cycles, right? People experience heat stress typically when they have had overexertion. So they're doing not only just a manual labor job, but any sort of exertion. And OSHA has some nifty information on their website that shows sort of levels of exertion. We don't have time to go into it now, but me sitting here giving a webinar presentation, there's some level of energy and exertion that I am expending. Someone who is digging ditches at a construction site is expending far more exertion than me sitting here. So there's various levels and intervals of exertion. OSHA looks at that and is thinking about, okay, where should you and when should you have work rest cycles? When you've got heavy exertion, certainly, right? And what should those rest cycles be? Should they be essentially, should there be a flexible standard where the worker and the employer get to engage together and decide that any day, any sort of day? Okay, safety supervisor walks around or operational manager sees that some guy or gal doesn't look like they're doing well. Should you say, hey, and it's over 80 degrees, go inside and rest, or let's move you into the pulpit indoors, or let's get you into a shaded area, sort of randomly? Or should there be a set schedule? For every hour worked, you get 15 minutes of rest, or something like that. That's all to be decided, and all things that employers should be weighing in through this rulemaking process. And we're happy to obviously work with you all on that to show OSHA what works and what doesn't based on your own programming and prevention of heat stress. potable water. We need potable water. I think that's sort of a, heat stress 101. We need workers to be able to access readily cool water. So how do you do that? California has a sort of set of rules about how you do it. Different states are looking at different options that are considering rules. We've got multiple states already with heat stress rules on the books. I'll talk about those in a sec. Different ways to do water. Could the rule simply be you, employer, have to make sure your employers have a readily accessible water all day long, cool, not hot water? I think that the agency should build in some flexibility on that, how they get the water to the folks, whether it's bottled water that they bring in by the jug, whether it's fresh fruit, whether it's electrolytes, whether it's quenchers, hydration, more broadly. How do you hydrate your workers, right? That's going to be part of the rule. Acclimatization, Ashley talked a little bit about that. Acclimatization is in all likelihood going to be addressed in OSHA's rule. How they're going to do it, we don't know yet. But acclimatization, as Ashley explained, is, where workers are not used to hot weather. I've got a fellow out front right now working on putting a light fixture on the front of the porch. And it's pretty hot. It's not horrible. It's only in the 80s here today, not terribly humid. But he came around the corner a little while ago and was really, sweating. I got him a big jug of water. He's got that out there. But is he used to working in that weather every day? If he is, he's probably acclimatized. It's probably okay. He's less likely, not impossible, but less likely to suffer from heat stress. But if he's normally working indoors and he's just one day working in an outdoor situation, even in temperatures at 85 degrees, you could have problems. So acclimatization is an important consideration for employers as you think about voluntary programs and as we think about what OSHA's rule should have in it. Training. To me, with heat stress in particular, this is an absolutely critical component. And I encourage OSHA to develop robust training requirements in a heat rule. The reason is, unlike some hazards, where I deal with a lot of chemical hazards in the workplace for our employer client base. Unlike those hazards and a lot of different hazards, typical safety hazards, you kind of know it when you see it. If you're dangling, 12 feet high and you don't have fall protection on, that there's a risk, a fall hazard risk. Here, heat stress and heat illness can sneak up on you, and you really do have to, you, the worker, and you, the employer, and the safety guys and the operationals supervisors have to understand the signs and symptoms of heat stress. Because if you do understand those, it's pretty simple to protect yourself. It doesn't even take, fall equipment, right? It takes water, rest, shade. In the end, that's really what this rule ought to be about. And it's what you all are doing effectively out there, at least those of you I've talked to. But you have to know it when you see it. And it's not like, it's not like pornography, and you don't know it necessarily when you see it. So you have to be trained and trained well, and robust training programs. And I don't think any of us would discourage OSHA from including a lot of training materials, a lot of guidance materials, maybe even mandatory appendices on training in a heat illness rule. Emergency response plans. That's the next piece, big component of what is likely going to be a final rule when OSHA gets there. And we'll talk in just a second about when OSHA might get there. We've got to have a situation where if an emergency arises, if an employee is suffering from heat stress, what do you as the first responder do? What tools do you need? What materials do you need? Electrolytes on hand. How do you get someone cool fast? What do you do? What shouldn't you do? That's all going to be part of what OSHA considers as what goes into a heat illness rule. And finally, this is a really controversial piece: physiological, medical, biomonitoring, exposure monitoring of workers. There are some really nifty tools out there. I just addressed the NIOSH work group on heat stress the other day, and it was a good timing because the night before on the national news, I am still one of the 13 people in America who watches the national news when I can. There was a big story on these cool biomonitoring tools. My daughters are lacrosse players in college, and they wear heart monitors when they play or when they practice so they can monitor and keep track of their heart rate. Well, these biomonitoring tools are similar devices that workers would wear around, and it would give the employer all kinds of really useful information like blood pressure, heart rate. I don't know all the things it would give you, but it would give employers a lot of information. That is terribly problematic to both employees and employers from a privacy standpoint. It's a cool IT tool, but there's a lot of concern about including any sort of requirement in heat rule about that would require employers to be monitoring medical biological information about employees. So watch that. We're watching that space very carefully to see what might be in a rule, and we're providing comments. And this is a rulemaking. OSHA is going to be taking lots of comments throughout this process, and I encourage all of you who are stakeholders on this, whose facilities are impacted by heat, to weigh into OSHA, provide information on what works and what doesn't work. Work with us or don't work with us, but just get it into the docket. All right, let's keep going here. Ashley? Okay, heat illness rulemaking. Just a little bit on timing. As I mentioned, this ANPRNM came out in October. That was one of the first stages of the public, facing piece of the rulemaking process. We, as I mentioned, submitted comments, a fairly robust set of comments. We have more to say, but at least we got some hopefully useful information to OSHA in January of this year. The public comment period on the ANPRM closed in January. However, NIOSH heat illness work group has formed, and NIOSH holds public meetings where any public stakeholder or citizen can participate. You can listen in, you can also speak. On behalf of the coalition, I've spoke at both the last couple of meetings in February and June, and you get a real sense for where OSHA is going and where this heat illness work group is going. The work group is a group that is going to advise OSHA on what the heat rules should look like, and they will even develop regulatory language. So it's an important group to be aware of. And so we're working, listening to them and trying to share information with the NIOSH heat group throughout this year and next year. Their next meeting is in September. We'll plan to participate. I encourage you all to do as well. And we just most recently had this, well, I guess not most recently, June was the NIOSH meeting where I spoke, but in May, we had a public stakeholder meeting that OSHA shared. It wasn't related to NIOSH, the whole world. Anyone could participate, anyone could listen in. Again, we spoke at that to try to provide OSHA some guidance, some thoughts about our employers, clients, programs that work. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to spend more than 30 seconds on this next slide, but this is a rulemaking slide that I use in a lot of our webinars, and it sort of just lays out the very complex process that has developed over history based mainly on litigation, where OSHA, gets sued once they issue a final rule. And so in response, they try to develop, sort of litigation-proof rules. And in the process, they have a very elaborate and very time-consuming process to develop a rule. There's some controversy about whether OSHA should do all this pre-rule process. A lot of employers like it, and it's very good in the sense that it provides a lot of, in fact, often years of opportunity for employers to weigh in on a rule. However, let me just show you this slide. You don't have to look at all the teeny little writing. You'll have it if you're interested, and I'm happy to talk through it. For heat, we're basically in stage 2 of a multi-stage process. I believe it's OSHA's calculations that are at the bottom of that slide there. About 2.5 to 6 years from this stage that we're at to get to a final rule. Now, if you think of the political calendar, look where we are in the Biden administration. I'm going out on a limb to say that I expect that if there is not a second Biden or other Democratic administration, and there's a Republican administration, Trump or otherwise, this heat illness rulemaking will sort of the move forward momentum will die down, if not halt entirely. It is, I think, virtually impossible, if not impossible. In fact, I would say, Kate McMahon would say it's impossible for OSHA to promulgate a final heat illness rule in this term. So query what is going to happen to this rulemaking. I think the administration is attempting to move as aggressively as they can to get to the place where they move the rulemaking process along as far as they can, with the hopes that there'll be a second Democratic administration to finish the job and or at least sort of get it set for maybe some additional activities depending on who the Republican president is and who the head of OSHA is under a Republican president. So that's really all I wanted to say. Lots more opportunity. And the next one is the next major opportunity here, aside from this NIOSH stuff, is the SBREFA process, the Small Business Enforcement Fairness Act, which is a law that basically gives small business extra opportunity to have input into rulemakings that will impact small business. Certainly this one will. There will be a SBREFA review process. It has not begun yet. I expect it will begin in this term. We, along with Bruce Lundgren at the SBA, will provide lots of information on how you, if you are a small business, can participate in that. A panel is put together by the Small Business Administration, and SERs, SERs, small entity representatives, are chosen among small business, and sometimes even with input from larger businesses to provide input. Ultimately, a panel report is developed by the SBA, and that panel report goes to OSHA, and it should have a fairly significant impact on the outcome of the rulemaking process. Also, the other thing I'll say before we move off this slide is the OMB process. The White House weighs in too, right? Even though it is their administration, the White House takes other considerations outside of just what OSHA's more narrow focus is, which is risk, hazard information, and hazard potential and feasibility, both technological as well as economic feasibility. That is what the OSHA Act requires OSHA to concern itself with. But the administration, the White House, OMB, even in a Democratic administration, are going to take political considerations into consideration, political issues into consideration. They're going to take economic issues into consideration. So that is, the OMB is also another avenue and opportunity to provide information to ultimately maybe influence the direction OSHA is going. And then the proposed rule. My view of this is by the time you get to a proposed rule, you know, there's a lot of water that's gone under the bridge. The OSHA is kind of feeling pretty comfortable about their rule. They've done all the stuff you're seeing on that slide, right? It is tough to, in public comment or the public hearing, change the entire direction of a rule early and often, as you say in, you know, politics. Vote early and often, weigh in early and often before you get to the stage of an NPRM, a proposed rule. Okay, enough on that. We're getting very close to the time that we want to kind of, you know, end this and leave maybe some room for questions. So let me fly through the next couple of points. These are very state focused, so not all of you out there are, you know, focused on these states, but just so you know, OSHA, California has a heat illness rule. The rule is for outdoor places of employment, but the agency is very seriously considering a companion rule that will deal with indoor heat, like OSHA is doing. Right out of the box, written program, training, not too bad. Supplying water, but California is pretty rigid. You have to, you know, have readily available water, and the default is if you can't have a replenished, you know, sort of drinking fountain type situation, you've got to have enough water, cool water, for 1 quart of water per employee per hour per shift. So pretty clear command and control what is required. And on that issue, that one of the big debates on the federal level with the heat standard is, do we want a flexible, performance-oriented standard where there isn't a lot of that 1 hour, 1 quart per hour per employee? We want to leave it to ourselves to figure out what works, or do we want something? The one argument that some make to a command and control, very rigid, very clear rule is it is clear. You know what you have to do, and with heat, if it's water, rest, shade, maybe it's easier to have OSHA tell you what to do. I think the large majority of employers would say, no, that's okay. We know how to protect our employees. We know how to deal with these things, especially since it's going to be more than just water, rest, shade, right? It's going to be acclimatization. It's going to be training. So anyway, back to California. Basically, you have to look at the temperatures. One thing we have to know as employers, we have got to have a system, whatever state we're in, we have got to know what the temperature is and what the humidity is every day. And we're not just talking about the people in Alabama and Mississippi, right? Look at what happened in Washington and Oregon last summer, right? They had record heat wave with record temperatures, even compared to what we were seeing in the Southeast and Southwest. So everyone in the nation has got to figure out how you're going to know on a daily basis, on a shift basis, what the temperature is that your employees are experiencing, including what the, building in, as Ashley was explaining in the beginning, building in the humidity factor, if not other factors. Okay, so in California, the requirements go up as you get hotter, and when you hit 95, there's extra requirements that are triggered. Ashley, let's just fly through the next couple of slides. Okay, one point. Heat illness, when you're talking about enforcement in California, heat illness is now number 2. So all you California employers, or those employers of national employers of California facilities, this is to an OSHA lawyer, a shocking statistic, because HAZCOM, lockout, tag out, I2P2 in California, the things we see always as the top 5, they've been displaced by heat illness, not I2P2, but the others. And so OSHA, Cal-OSHA is all over it and will be at least for the next few months. So really look at your programs, because you want to not get a citation in this area. More important, you want to make sure your guys and gals are safe. Okay, next slide. This slide just gives you, and again, if any of you are interested and you're in those states, please reach out to us. We're happy to share more. But just so you know, we wanted to let, sort of tab for you. Maryland is considering, in fact, the legislature passed a law. There is a statute that tells MOSH, the Maryland Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that they have got to adopt a heat illness prevention regulation. They have not done that yet, but I mean, it's not on the books yet, but I'm sure they're working on it. Minnesota, surprisingly, but Minnesota has a standard right now, applies only to indoor spaces right now, but it has a heat illness standard for indoor spaces. Nevada, there's an ongoing rulemaking, so look out in Nevada for a rulemaking. I know from a little bit of intel that we're trying to gather that they're working very aggressively on getting that rule in place as quickly as they can. Oregon and Washington both have on the books heat illness regulations. Oregon's just went into effect last month. Washington's is outdoor spaces only. But I think we've got links and we can provide all kinds of information if you'd like. Next slide. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sam Rose. Sam is the newest of us, or one of the newest of my colleagues to join our law firm. Sam, we're very, very happy to have him. He's based in Los Angeles. I didn't give Ashley enough credit. She's based in Chicago. She's been working on this heat stuff with another of my colleagues and myself throughout the process. So Ashley's an expert on heat. Sam is learning all about, as he joins our firm and becomes an expert in certain subject matter areas, all about wildfire smoke standards. And Sam, let me turn it over to you to share a little bit about the Western states and what's happening on wildfire smoke.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to briefly touch on wildfire smoke standards. We are coming into peak fire season right now on the West Coast, and amid a record drought in California and in other states, it's really important that employers give themselves a refresher on any applicable wildfire smoke standards in their state. So right now, California, Oregon, and Washington currently have standards that are in effect. And just to be clear, these standards are always in effect, but obviously more important during fire season or when there are fires burning around these states and the areas in which the employers are in. So I just want to briefly touch on the main points for each of the 3 states and their wildfire smoke standards, and we'll start with my home state of California. So the California wildfire smoke rule is found in Title 8, Section 5141.1. There was a temporary standard that went into effect in July of 2019. This permanent standard took effect in February of 2021. And you can see on the screen what it applies to and what the requirements are. Currently, it's when the AQI for PM 2.5 is 151 or higher, and the employer can reasonably anticipate employees may be exposed to wildfire smoke. There's 4 exceptions when employees will be working in enclosed buildings or structures, enclosed vehicles, where the employer can show that the air quality index doesn't exceed the requirement, or when employees are exposed to that air quality index of 151 or higher for an hour or less in each shift. Next slide, Ashley. Thank you. So these are what the standard requires, which is that employers ID harmful exposures to airborne matter, and they have to check for the air quality index. They have to supply N95 respirators at a certain point when the air quality index reaches a higher level. A communication requirement to employees about various hazards and the employer's response to those hazards, and then a training and instruction requirement, which, as Kate has mentioned, is not necessarily the worst requirement. Next slide. So these are the requirements that California requires employers to use for reducing exposure. It starts with engineering controls when they're possible, allowing employees to work in enclosed structures or in enclosed vehicles. If it's not possible, then that's when administrative controls can come into place, such as relocating employees to working in areas where the air quality index is lower, changing work schedules, that kind of tactic. And then last is respiratory equipment. So at a certain point when the air quality index is between 151 and 500, employers are required to provide and encourage their employees to use respirators. That's on a voluntary basis. When it exceeds 500, that's when employees are required to use respirators. So it's no longer on a voluntary basis. But in either circumstance, the employer is required to provide them. So Oregon also has a wildfire standard. It's found in their administrative rules. There's one for general industry, one for agriculture, and it actually just went into effect at the beginning of this month. So it's fairly new. Employers in Oregon are already challenging in court the standard, but it is currently in effect. And as far as we're aware, there's no court that has said that the enforcement of it has to be stopped at this point. It does have the same 3 exceptions: enclosed buildings, enclosed vehicles, when the AQI has not reached the standard, and then obviously when employees are working at home. It's important to just note that it's a different air quality index than California. It's 101 or higher, which is a little bit lower. So you'll just want to be aware of that if you are in Oregon. So similar requirements to the California one. I think you'll see a lot of these requirements are similar, but the employer is required to conduct an exposure assessment at the start of each shift, provide training, and develop a communication system where supervisors and employees can communicate regarding hazards that they're experiencing on the ground. So Washington has not passed an official wildfire smoke rule. They currently have an emergency rule that went into effect last month, June 15th. It applies to workplaces where the current air quality index for PM 2.5 is 69 or higher, so much lower than California and Oregon. And it has some pretty intricate requirements. The employer is required to determine the levels at the work sites, monitor employees who display symptoms, train employees who can be exposed to this type of air quality index. It's a new requirement in this emergency standard that there are HAZCOM requirements, and I made a list of some of them. There's a lot, so you'll want to be aware if you are an employer in Washington or you have employees in Washington. You're required to notify employees of 2 consecutive readings of 69 or more, after any reading of 101 or higher, and after any reading that's beyond what the air quality index can measure. You're also required to develop a smoke response plan that has to be included in your accident prevention program, and it has various requirements that you can find in the standard. But it's a very intricate standard. It has a lot of requirements, so you'll just want to be aware of them. And if anybody is in Washington and wants some help, you can definitely reach out to us and we can walk you through it. So I'll turn it over to Kate to talk about hurricanes and superstorms.
All right. We're just about on time. We have 1 minute left. And I promised myself, even with my singing, and by the way, just so everyone knows, if anyone is out there, in my head, I sounded just like James Taylor. Okay. So, not sure that's what you heard, but it's probably an IT issue with the audio or something. Anyway, let me wrap up. We wanted to kind of talk about, just for a minute, superstorms, but this is, I don't know why we titled it hurricanes and superstorms, because unless superstorms is a very broad term, I mean, we're talking, tornadoes, hurricanes, mudslides, wildfires, cyclones. I don't think we're having any cyclones in the US yet, but God knows what's going to happen in the next little while. So anyway, lots of storms. The main thing we want to convey is, really twofold. One, OSHA and the Weather Service and NIOSH and the CDC and everyone is getting involved in the game of being prepared to respond to handle these superstorms. I will use that term to be sort of a broad term for what I'm talking about, not just hurricanes, right? And so there's lots. The good news is most of those are not enforcement agencies, right? Other than OSHA, but there's lots of developing information on how you can get warnings early on storms. Our technology is fabulous these days, and we often can find out days ahead of when a major event is going to happen, but still not always in time. I mean, look what's happening in Yellowstone right now. Obviously, we knew about the spread of the wildfire, but we could not have predicted, the best experts among us could not have predicted how quickly it was going to move. So I guess what I want to do is encourage preparedness. This is not an enforcement thing. This is we're employers and we need to protect our workers. I don't know who's on this webinar. I don't know if the Mayfield company is on, but you all probably heard about the very tragic event where I think 8 workers were killed last December in the Mayfield's candle factory in Kentucky with a tornado that whipped through. And there's a major enforcement action that's going on. There's major civil litigation that's going on. So be prepared. Look for the, and again, we can share this with you, but look for the publicly available data that will show you what you need to know when there's a tropical storm watch in effect in your plant's area, when there's a hurricane warning in effect, et cetera, okay? And then know, and if you want to do this with a written plan, that would be super from OSHA's perspective, and it probably would be super from your corporate safety group's perspective. Look for, be prepared to know what should happen in the event you need to move fast. You need to either evacuate employees. You need to get employees under cover because there is not time to evacuate. Know the conditions that activate the plan, know the functions that each and every person who's involved in the chain of responsibility has to carry out the plan, know what those specific detailed procedures are. I am certain all of you have sat through, probably on a weekly, if not monthly basis, pre-COVID, when we had in-person meetings, right? Meetings where someone would start out and say, okay, before we start out, let me just tell you where the bathrooms are. Let me tell you when we're having lunch, and let me tell you where the emergency exits are. And honestly, I focused on the first two and I rarely focused on the third. It seems so unlikely. But that little thing, that little piece of information, understanding it, sharing it, communicating it effectively is critical when you might have a tornado whip up in a matter of hours, right? So we have to know the information and convey it to our employees and train them to know what to do. Just because we convey it, just because there's signage up, does not mean that every employee is going to know where to shelter. Do drills, practice. And then post-event procedures for accounting for personnel. We represent a number of clients in the Houston area, and I remember very vividly after Hurricane Harvey, days after Hurricane Harvey hit, there was still work being done by exceptional employers in the health and safety area. These are big companies who know how to do it right. They were still accounting for personnel. So have a plan in place. Hopefully one you'll never have to use, but have a plan. Final slide. I don't know where you are, Ashley, because I'm on a different slide, but I think the final slide that I have, let me just go back to you guys. One previous, sorry. One previous, yeah. Response and recovery operations. The only thing I want to say here, I want to say two things. One, same sort of message. I want to drill home the need to have these best practices in place. And we've got a nice slide that kind of tells you what OSHA thinks about best practices for response and recovery operations. And we do a lot of work in this area with our clients getting prepared. So let us know if you need help. The other thing, though, I want to at least mention is that OSHA is in the process of a rulemaking on emergency response and preparedness. This rulemaking was, originated really to update the standard, the various places where these standards exist on emergency response and preparedness, HAZWOPER and others, because, the standards are woefully out of date. There's been technology advancements, there's PPE advancements, so they're bringing it up to speed. But the other thing that is happening in this rulemaking is they are considering an expanded group of hazards driven by climate change to bring us full circle to climate change. So in this emergency response and preparedness rulemaking, OSHA is looking at climate change hazards and considering how to update the rule to deal with those. So that's really, I think now we can kind of show our marketing materials or whatnot. That's all we've got to share. It looks like we have sort of run past our time, although not nearly as far past as I typically go. So I'm pleased about that. I think what we should do to stay on track, I don't know if any of you guys, well, I've been talking, have been storms whipping up, have been responding to chat questions. But what we'll do is we will get back to you all who have chatted with emails, because I think we have your email, so we can get back with responses. And again, as my partner Eric Kahn always says, please feel free to reach out. This isn't a chargeable thing. This is just a talk. We want more than anything to help you all help protect your employees. That's what we live and spend our days doing. So please let us help you, help them. Stay safe, and we look forward to talking again. I'm sure somewhere in the slide deck, there's a webinar series listing. So I don't know what our next webinar is. It'll be sometime in August, and we look forward to talking to you all again then. Thank you very much.